So our second movie this semester will be the 1931 Dracula, quite possibly one of the most famous horror movies ever, and certainly Bela Lugosi's most famous role as Dracula. This is a very well-known movie and is part of most movie anthologies of the greatest horror movies ever. Uh, Dracula was directed by Todd Browning. Todd Browning was famous for several films. He is not a terribly well known director to modern audiences, but he loved working with Lon Chaney. He also directed a movie that I've used in another class called Freaks, starring at the time what people called circus freaks. It's an interesting movie. And then later on, he combined Lon Chaney with some of the characters from Freaks into yet another movie. And Dracula would fit into this category of one of Todd Browning's more well known films. Bela Lugosi, who stars as Dracula, had a film career before Dracula, but ultimately it was this role that made him the most famous. Unfortunately, he had a hard time breaking away from being Dracula, or at least being in horror movies. He spent the rest of his career pretty much being typecast in movies like this, or at least movies that were somewhat scary. And you could see a variety of films that starred Lugosi. They were either horror movies or vampire movies, and even if they got comical, they were still horror slash vampire movies. My son the Vampire being one of those funny vampire movies starring Bela Lugosi. Late in his career, Lugosi struck up a relationship with a director named Ed Wood Jr., and Lugosi actually appeared in several Ed Wood films. If you don't know anything about Ed Wood, his films are awful. He was an awful director, and his films were unintentionally awful. Ed Wood was trying to make good movies, but ultimately his movies are terrible. And the three that Lugosi starred in, Glenn or Glenda, Bride of the Monster, and the most famous one would be Plan 9 from Outer Space. Many people consider Plan 9 from Outer Space to be the worst movie ever. There are lots of lists of the worst movie ever, and for many people, Plan 9 is at the top of that list. It's at the top of my list, and when I've taught Plan 9 from Outer Space, I have taught it as the worst movie ever made. Lugosi actually died while making Plan 9 from Outer Space with Ed Wood, and we'll come back to that a little bit later because it's kind of an interesting story that dovetails into Lugosi's career and what Lugosi was known for. Prince talks about Dracula the film Dracula, as part of the horror film genre, and he does that in chapter 7. For Prince, monsters in horror films really attack our sense of normality. So you can think of normality in a variety of ways. You can think of normality as normality as heterosexual coupling. You can think of normality as the nuclear family. You can think of normality as kind of conventional parent-child relationships. And monsters seem to threaten all of that. Film monsters are both human and inhuman at the same time, and that's what really makes them scary. Much like in Nosferatu, there were concerns about who was sick and who wasn't. Film monsters are often both human and inhuman at the same time, especially in horror films. Not as much in science fiction, but in horror films, the horror film questions what it means to be a human being. If you could have these kinds of monsters that are both human and inhuman at the same time, it really undermines our sense of human identity. And ultimately, horror films of the 1930s and 40s didn't have a lot of special effects. To scare audiences, they really relied heavily on makeup, which is not what we think of today when we think of horror films. We think of a lot of special effects. For Robin Wood, for the article that we read for this class, Robin Wood feels that Dracula is part of Victorian sexual repressiveness. In other words, the Dracula narratives are about the unease of womanhood, that men felt threatened by women in this period, and Dracula was a way to kind of counteract that. There's also a sense that the narrative technique of Dracula is somewhat unnerving. The book uses a diary, journal, letter format that Wood is not a fan of, and we'll see more of that in some of our later films. Dracula and Transylvania are foreign. They're other, they're remote, they're inaccessible. To be other, uh, with a capital O, others are marginalized, they're demonized, they're lesser than mainstream society. And for me, vampires are the ultimate other. They come from this kind of unknowable foreign place known as Transylvania that no one's ever been to. They don't seem to have a religion. They don't seem to have a culture beyond being a vampire. They reproduce in asexual ways. So everything about a vampire is different in a negative way, and that's what makes them other with a capital O. And then in a lot of ways, and you'll see this in a lot of our vampire films, Dracula and Transylvania are constructed as dreamlike. They're not real. It's almost like the characters in the film are having a dream. And if they are a dream, that dream is really a nightmare because this isn't a dream anyone would want to have. Wood also talks about Dracula's comprehensive potency. Ultimately, what Wood is talking about is where does Dracula derive his power from? And for Dracula, one of the sources of power that he has is that he's irresistible. He's strong. He's supernatural. Those are areas that he draws strength from. He is promiscuous. He seems to have a lot of sexual freedom, a lot of sexual partners, even if it's not what we think of as normative sexuality. His sexuality is non-procreative, so he is not producing children, and it's not why he has sex. Ultimately, he does kind of have children, but they're not children in the sense that we would think of. He has an abnormal sexuality. I mean, I think that that's very clear in these films and in the novel. I mean, he is biting people to reproduce, and that is a pretty abnormal form of sexuality. He bites men, he bites women. The people he bite men and bite women. So there is no kind of heterosexuality in these films. It's really a bisexuality. He doesn't make any distinctions between reproducing with men or women. Sometimes, if you follow these movies close enough, the people that he bites and turns into vampires, he then reproduces with. So there's kind of an incestual narrative there that's interesting and disturbing all at the same time. And then you'll see in some of the later films that children can be vampires, and that there is a kind of children reproducing, so a kind of child sexuality that's again all part of the power of the vampire myth. Wood also uses a Freudian analysis, what we call psychoanalysis, to discuss Dracula. So in Wood's discussion, Dracula represents the id. So for most of us, id is the negative. It is the dark side, if you will. Van Helsing represents the superego, so that would be the good side. So the id and the superego are constantly at war in psychoanalysis. And what are they fighting for? They're fighting for the ego, which is the sense of self. And Mina represents the ego within this kind of triangle of id, superego, and ego that Wood is discussing. Vampire films have similar imagery, similar narratives, and Dracula is no exception to that. So early in the film, this guy mentions Nosferatu, and people get all worked up and shut him up. And that's, of course, an allusion to the previous film that we just watched. You can see crosses being used as both weapons and as protection, and that is a theme that we see in Dracula narratives all the time. And then, of course, Dracula doesn't cast a shadow, or cast a reflection, I'm sorry, and that reveals him to be a vampire, and we will see that again and again and again. The film Dracula plays with light and shadows and camera angles, and keep in mind as we talk about the vampire films throughout the semester, we're really talking about film in general, and the vampire films are really just an example. A lot of what we talk about can be applied to all kinds of films. So in terms of camera angles, if you shoot someone from below, that makes that character look bigger and more powerful. And you can see this is an excellent shot of Dracula being shot from below, again, made to look big and powerful. He kind of fills the screen. Uh, Renfield is shot from above, and shooting someone from above can make them look small and weak, and that's what we see here in this shot of Renfield. And then finally, Dracula plays with alternate light sources. So sometimes it's to highlight his face, sometimes it's to highlight his eyes. But ultimately, these are not natural light sources, obviously, that are lighting up his face, and those can create shadows, and in this particular case, kind of create an eerie feel. So you can see that camera angles and light and shadows are something that are used in all kinds of films, and our films are just one really good example of that. So to get back to the Ed Wood story, in 1994, Tim Burton made a movie called Ed Wood, starring Johnny Depp, and it was an excellent movie. It was really, really a very good movie. And the movie itself focused on the life of Ed Wood, at least his filmmaking life, and it highlighted the relationship that Wood had with Bela Lugosi, and ultimately what Bela Lugosi's contribution was to Plan 9 from Outer Space, which was Lugosi's final film. So because Lugosi died while making Plan 9, Ed Wood had filmed a bunch of scenes with him that he had never really intended to use. And Ed Wood decided that he was just going to keep those scenes in the film and inserted them into the film in somewhat peculiar ways. These are actual shots of Plan 9, and you can see on the left you have the day-walking Bela Lugosi vampire, and he was just asking Bela Lugosi to walk around when he filmed that. That wasn't meant to be in the film. And then the scene on the right, these are actual shots from Plan 9. It's just Bela Lugosi walking out of a house that Ed Wood was filming for no real purpose. Both of those shots ended up in the film as part of the narrative. Again, Plan 9 is a pretty awful movie. Once Bela Lugosi had died, Ed Wood brought in a body double to play the role that Bela Lugosi was supposed to play. So there you see him on the right, and of course that is not Bela Lugosi. The body double would often cover his face so that you couldn't tell that it wasn't Bela Lugosi, and he would walk around like that in almost every scene. Viewers have noted that the body double was considerably taller than the actual Bela Lugosi, who was not all that tall. So it's pretty obvious throughout the film that that's not Bela Lugosi. Ed Wood was a very good film, as I've said. It led to 2 Oscars. Martin Landau won Best Supporting Actor for his depiction of Bela Lugosi. You can see him there, dressed as Bela Lugosi, and it was a very convincing portrayal. Part of making that convincing was an excellent job with makeup, and 3 people won the Oscar for Best Makeup in Ed Wood. It's a film I highly recommend. It's really kind of entertaining. It's very Tim Burton-y. It's very Johnny Depp-y, but it's certainly worth watching. You might also have noticed that the bat symbol in the opening credits of Dracula struck me as being kind of familiar, and I thought it looked a lot like the Batman symbol, and I can see there are several similarities there, and I thought, well, that kind of makes sense. It's just kind of an illusion. But the Batman symbol, the comic itself, didn't actually debut until 1939, a full 8 years after Dracula, which leads me to believe that maybe they borrowed the Batman symbol from Dracula, which is kind of funny. There's no evidence of that, but that's my little conspiracy theory. So what are the key takeaways of Dracula? Well, Dracula used light, shadows, and camera angles to convey meaning. Many movies do, but this is an excellent example of that. This is the film that established Bela Lugosi as a major actor, at the same time ruined his career. Dracula, again, was one of the first original horror films and is part of many horror film anthologies when you buy DVD sets, or if you were to see a horror film marathon of classic horror films in a theater, Dracula would most certainly be among them. We have moved much closer to the actual Bram Stoker narrative. In Dracula, Nosferatu deviated considerably from the Stoker story, but Dracula is bringing us much closer to what Stoker wrote about. And there are elements of this Dracula narrative in many of the future films that we'll watch. So it'll be important to keep this film in mind as we look at other films that are either called Dracula or at least utilize the Dracula narrative.